The town of Deerbrook always seemed like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. Tucked between quiet hills and aging maple groves, it was a picture of old-world charm. Streets lined with gingerbread trim houses, a gazebo in the center of town where school bands played every summer, and a clock tower that chimed faithfully every hour. For generations, the people of Deerbrook had lived by a simple code: trust your neighbor, help when you can, and don't lock your doors unless you're out of town. Sheriff Frank Harlan had seen little more than the occasional teenage mischief or a late-night noise complaint in his 30-year tenure. It was peaceful, he often said. The kind of place where you knew everyone by name, where folks dropped off casseroles after a funeral and left their car keys in the ignition without worry. So when the Morgans moved into the old Victorian on Cypress Lane, no one thought twice. If anything, people were relieved to see that house finally brought back to life. It had sat empty for years, overgrown and crumbling, since the last owner died without any family to claim it. But the Morgans, they were different. They were charming, generous. The kind of people a town like Deerbrook didn't just tolerate, they embraced. David Morgan was a software developer who worked from home, and he quickly became a regular at Betty's Diner, buying coffee for strangers and offering free tech advice to the elderly folks trying to FaceTime their grandkids. His wife, Rachel, had once been an art teacher, and she practically lived at the elementary school, volunteering in every classroom, organizing art fairs, even painting murals with the children. They had 2 kids, Lily, 15, and Max, 12, both bright, polite, and well-liked. It didn't take long before the whole town was singing their praises. David set up free tech workshops at the library. Rachel launched an art therapy program for kids struggling with grief. They hosted 4th of July cookouts, Halloween haunted houses, and winter coat drives. Lily led the debate team to its first state championship. Max helped older neighbors carry groceries and rake their leaves without being asked. The Morgans were the best thing to happen to Deerbrook in a long time, said Martha Whitaker, who ran the town bakery. Rachel came in every Saturday morning and always remembered how I liked my coffee. When I was out sick, she dropped off soup. Who does that anymore? Even Sheriff Harlan was impressed. They weren't just good neighbors, he recalled later. They were the glue. They made everyone feel seen, appreciated. The Morgan home, once an eyesore, became a local landmark after they restored it. Bright, clean siding, fresh paint on the gingerbread trim, flower beds that seemed to bloom year-round. But what most people admired was the backyard, an immaculate garden winding between sculpted hedges and hand-laid stone paths. At the center stood an old stone well, sealed with a thick wooden lid and surrounded by wildflowers. Locals thought it was a nice touch, a nod to the house's history. The Morgans said they reinforced it for safety, so no neighborhood kid would accidentally fall in. No one questioned it. Why would they? There were whispers, of course. The Morgans never let anyone upstairs when they visited. They always had an excuse. Renovations, water damage, boxes to unpack. At parties, they'd vanish for 10 minutes, come back smiling but a little too stiff. And every few months, they'd disappear altogether for a week or 2. Visiting family, they'd say. Business trips, school competitions. They always brought back souvenirs, like they'd planned the absences just to make sure they left a good impression behind. But the strange thing was, their departures always seemed to come at convenient times. Like after that odd chemical smell neighbors noticed coming from the backyard, or when someone complained about hearing strange noises at night. The Morgans would be gone the next day, smiling in Facebook photos from some far-off national park or European cafe. No one thought much of it, until the storm came. The kind of rain Deerbrook hadn't seen in decades, and when the ground finally gave way behind the Morgan house, something ancient and unholy clawed its way to the surface. The storm began with a low rumble in the distance, nothing more than a whisper across the treetops. But by nightfall, it had become a roaring presence. Thunder shaking window panes, rain falling in thick, relentless sheets. The streets of Deerbrook flooded. Creeks overflowed. Cellars filled with muddy water as if the earth itself had turned against the town. But the worst of it hit Cypress Lane. By morning, the backyard behind the Morgans' house was a churning swamp. Water had pooled around the old well, loosening the soil, eroding the ground beneath the stone base. And then, around 3 a.m., the well collapsed. Not just the cover, but the structure itself, cracking open like a rotten tooth, and when the water receded, it left behind a sinkhole nearly 10 feet across, revealing something no one in town was prepared to see. It wasn't just a hole. It was a gateway, an opening into something carved out long before the Morgans ever arrived. Sheriff Harlan was the first to arrive after concerned neighbors reported the cave-in and the unbearable stench rising from the yard. He stepped through the Morgans' ruined garden, past the overturned flower pots and drowned roses, and peered into the pit. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. It wasn't natural, he said later. It looked like a cavern, but it had been altered. Someone had been using it. At first, it was hard to make sense of what lay below, but as the light reached deeper into the darkness, details came into focus. Stone steps leading down, metal tables, plastic sheeting, chemical drums, and then the remains, too many to count at a glance. Bodies in various stages of decay, some no more than skeletons, others preserved, wrapped in plastic, suspended in liquid-filled tubs. The stench of rot and chemicals was overwhelming, but worse than that was the silence of things that had once been alive. The Morgans were gone, their car, their phones, gone. No messages, no goodbyes, just silence and a backyard full of horror. It took less than a day for the FBI to arrive. The property was sealed off. Hazmat suits and forensic vans replaced garden gnomes and bird feeders. Deerbrook became the epicenter of something monstrous. What began as whispers turned to gasps, then full-blown panic. The perfect family, the heart of the community, had vanished like shadows before sunrise, leaving behind a trail of secrets and death. Investigators spent weeks cataloging what they found beneath that house. There were 17 confirmed victims. Some had likely been dead for years. Others, not so long. But it wasn't just the bodies that shook the agents. It was how they had been preserved. Tubes running through them, fluids that slowed decay, journals, notes, drawings, diagrams that spoke of something more than just murder, something methodical, something obsessed. It wasn't rage that fueled this, not jealousy, not revenge. It was something colder, a clinical, detached ambition. The Morgans had been documenting their work, writing as though they were scientists, not killers, as though the people they'd buried in that hole were specimens, not victims. The upstairs of the house, once off limits to visitors, revealed more of their secret life. A hidden lab, freezers, cameras, shelves filled with anatomy books, medical texts, and strange handwritten manuscripts detailing procedures that sounded more like rituals than science. They weren't just studying death. They were trying to conquer it. Back in the neighborhood, fear gripped every home. People who had laughed with the Morgans, broken bread with them, now couldn't sleep. They tore up family photos where the Morgans smiled in the background. They double-locked doors and unplugged phones. No one wanted to believe the truth, but it was everywhere, under their feet, in their memories, in the gaping hole behind the house that had once felt like a dream come true. Sheriff Harlan stood outside the property, watching the last body bag carried away. His hands trembled. "I thought I knew them," he whispered. "I thought we all did." For days, the town of Deerbrook hovered in a state of stunned disbelief. The local news descended with cameras and microphones, but the people had no words. Mothers who had once trusted Rachel Morgan with their children now held them closer, locking windows, checking over their shoulders. What had once been a home of laughter and light was now cordoned off with police tape and crawling with federal agents in white suits. And as investigators sifted through every inch of the Morgan house, the picture grew darker. The upper floors had been completely remodeled, not for comfort, but for containment. Soundproof panels lined the walls. Blackout curtains sealed every window. Surveillance systems fed into a central monitor room where every corner of the house, every entrance, every inch of the yard had been under watch. A false bookshelf in the hallway concealed a stairwell leading to a cold, sterile chamber filled with stainless steel tables, IV stands, blood analysis machines, and an array of tools more suited for a morgue than a family home. It was there that agents uncovered the Morgans' journals. Meticulously organized, dating back nearly a decade. Dozens of volumes chronicling every experiment, every failure, every adjustment in chemical ratios and tissue preservation techniques. Some pages were filled with graphs, others with disturbing sketches. Body parts connected to tubes, preserved organs suspended in labeled jars. Each entry was signed, David or Rachel, and sometimes Lily or Max. The realization hit hard. The children had been involved, not merely present, but participating, learning. The FBI brought in psychologists, criminal profilers, forensic pathologists. The consensus was grim. The Morgans hadn't just committed a series of grotesque murders. They had been attempting something far more ambitious, what they referred to in their writings as transcendence. They believed the human body could be preserved indefinitely. That consciousness could be reactivated. Their goal wasn't just to delay death. It was to erase it. The horror lay not just in what they had done, but in how ordinary they had seemed while doing it. There had been no signs of erratic behavior, no histories of violence or abuse. If anything, the Morgans had been models of composure, efficiency, charm. They'd brought casseroles to grieving families. They'd helped neighbors fix broken fences. They had embedded themselves so deeply into Deerbrook's fabric that even now, some residents couldn't let go of the image they'd once admired. "I keep remembering David helping me carry drywall into my garage," said Roger Hale, who lived across the street. "He laughed, he joked, he told me to stretch first or I'd pull my back. How does someone like that? How does a monster do that?" But the more they learned, the less the town understood. The victims in the underground chamber weren't all local. Some were transients. Others had been reported missing in neighboring towns. A few, shockingly, had never been reported missing at all. Most bore no clear signs of physical violence. Instead, it was as if they had simply been taken, dissected by intellect rather than cruelty, reduced to biological puzzles, and through it all, the central question remained, where were they now? The Morgans had vanished without a trace. No phone signals, no credit card use, no surveillance footage. It was as if they had disappeared into the fog. But that fog began to clear when a gas station security camera outside Helena, Montana, picked up an image of a man resembling David Morgan just 4 days after the storm. He was purchasing food, fuel, and supplies. Alone. By the time agents reached the area, he was gone. But they found tire tracks, a receipt, traces of one of the same chemical compounds used in the preservation process. It was the first of many sightings. Each time they arrived too late, and each time the trail grew colder. Until, months later, in a remote cabin deep in the mountains, they found something else. Something that proved the Morgans hadn't stopped. They were still experimenting, still chasing the impossible, still believing. The cabin was isolated, buried in the thick pine woods of northern Idaho, miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by snowdrifts and silence. A hunter reported the place after noticing a strange chemical odor seeping through the cracks of its boarded windows. When authorities arrived, the Morgans were long gone. But what they left behind made it clear this was no refuge. It was a workshop. Inside, the air was thick with decay, masked poorly by antiseptics. The main room had been stripped of any domestic comfort. No bed, no kitchen, no signs of ordinary life. Instead, there were makeshift workstations, medical tools, more journals, and on a slab in the center of the room, a preserved cadaver, rigged with wires, IV lines, and what looked like a crude circulation system. The subject was a man in his early 40s. Unidentified, his eyes had been stitched shut, his limbs arranged with surgical precision. Nearby, agents found a crate of labeled vials and a series of notes in Rachel Morgan's handwriting, cataloging the deterioration rates under various chemical formulas. They weren't hiding anymore. They were adapting. The journals recovered from the cabin showed that the Morgans had learned from their failures in Deerbrook. They had modified their techniques, introduced new compounds, and developed something they referred to as dynamic preservation, a process intended to maintain partial neural conductivity even after death. The goal wasn't to revive the body in full, but to create a vessel that could retain something, perhaps memory, perhaps consciousness. Most disturbing were the notes from the children. Lily and Max were no longer just assisting. They were leading entire phases of experimentation. Lily's sketches had become more intricate. Illustrations of cranial dissections, notes on cortical decay, theoretical models of synaptic reactivation. Max had authored pages on chemical stability, dosage timelines, and ethical arguments defending their work. "We are not destroying life," he wrote. "We are suspending it for future reclamation." The thought that children, once seen as polite, sweet, and deeply intelligent, had grown into this. It chilled even the most seasoned agents. These weren't victims of brainwashing. They were believers. By the time the evidence from the cabin was processed, it was clear the Morgans had likely fled the country. A rental agreement for the property had been signed under a false identity, traced to a private charter flight that departed from Washington State 2 days before the cabin was discovered. The flight ended in southern Alberta, Canada. From there, the trail vanished into the wilderness, but even as investigators hunted for their next trace, the impact on Deerbrook deepened. The town struggled to breathe beneath the weight of what had been revealed. School teachers who once praised Lily's essays now wondered if they had overlooked the warning signs. Parents spoke in hushed tones, sharing fears they didn't dare voice aloud. What if their child had been chosen next? Sheriff Harlan resigned quietly, retreating to his cabin outside town limits. He refused interviews, refused questions, only left his property once a week for groceries. The shame was written in every line of his face. Meanwhile, Deerbrook's once vibrant community events dried up. The annual Spring Festival was canceled. The high school debate team disbanded. People locked their doors even during the day. A quiet paranoia settled over everything, as if the town itself was holding its breath. And still, the question remained unanswered. Why? Why go through the trouble of embedding themselves so deeply into the town's heart, only to tear it apart from within? Why pretend? Why charm? Why help? One former classmate of Lily's, Kayla Bennett, offered a chilling theory during her interview with federal agents. She used to say the best subjects are the ones who trust you the most, that when people love you, they never see you coming. It was never just about preservation. It was about proximity, about being close enough to vanish behind a smile. The phrase echoed in investigators' minds. The best subjects are the ones who trust you the most. It explained so much and yet made everything worse. Deerbrook wasn't chosen by accident. It was targeted. The Morgans had studied the town like it was a living organism, found its vulnerabilities, its rhythms, its soft spots, and moved in like a virus. As more evidence surfaced, a clearer timeline formed. The Morgans had relocated every few years, always to quiet towns with limited law enforcement resources, strong community bonds, and aging populations. Places where a little charm went a long way. places where disappearances could be explained away as misadventures, accidents, or unreported runaways. In each town, the pattern was the same. They volunteered, they donated, they dazzled. And then, slowly, people began to vanish. Sometimes it was someone passing through, a traveler who never reached their next destination. Other times, it was someone on the margins, an elderly man without family, a woman recently evicted, couch surfing in desperation, people who might not be missed right away. The FBI eventually confirmed 3 previous locations where the Morgans had embedded themselves: a lakeside community in Minnesota, a rural district in upstate New York, and a small town in the Colorado Rockies. Each site had its own concealed structure, either an abandoned well, a sealed-off root cellar, or a repurposed storm shelter converted into private laboratories, and each location, once excavated, yielded remains. Not all identifiable, not all whole. The number of confirmed victims rose to 37. But the true count, no one could say. What unsettled investigators the most wasn't the scale, it was the purpose. Unlike typical serial crimes fueled by compulsion, the Morgans' actions were methodical, intellectual, intentional. They weren't killing for pleasure or power. They were pursuing a theory. One of the notebooks recovered from the New York site contained a section titled Threshold Experiments. The entries detailed efforts to stimulate reanimation in recently deceased tissue, electrical pulses, controlled chemical reoxygenation, neural mapping overlays. Failures were listed clinically, like lab reports. One note, written in David's hand, read, "Conscious reactivation remains elusive. Memory trace retention dissipates post-death spike. Further study required." But beneath the scientific detachment, there were moments of something more twisted. Rachel had written of emotional bridges, theorizing that proximity to familiar environments or people might aid in the preservation of consciousness. The subjects respond more favorably, she noted, when they die in places where they felt safe, when they die among people who cared. That was the part no one in Deerbrook could stomach. They hadn't just been deceived. They had been used, weaponized as part of the experiment. People who'd let the Morgans into their homes, their lives, their families, now questioned every moment, every hug, every favor, every conversation. "They studied us," said Martha Whitaker, her voice cracking. "We were their lab rats and didn't even know it." The psychological aftermath swept through town like a second storm. Dozens of families moved away, kids transferred schools. Couples who had once bonded over neighborhood barbecues now avoided eye contact in the grocery store. Trust, once Deerbrook's proudest virtue, had become its deepest wound. And then, just as the town began trying to rebuild, another letter arrived. It was postmarked from Montreal. No return address. It contained a single sheet of paper, typed in bold serif font, unsigned. It read, "The work continues. Not in fear, but in faith. We are not hiding. We are evolving. You'll understand one day. Until then, watch the water." The FBI treated it as authentic. The phrasing, the reference to water, it matched earlier journal entries. But for Deerbrook, the message felt more personal. Watch the water. They had buried the well, covered it, poured concrete and soil. But still, no one walked past the property anymore. They didn't talk about the Morgans in public, but they felt them, like a shadow stretching across the sun. The phrase, "watch the water," echoed through Deerbrook like a curse. People heard it in the rustle of the creek behind their homes, in the gurgle of plumbing at night, in the drip, drip, drip of faucets they swore they'd turned off. It wasn't just a message. It was a haunting. The letter ignited new waves of fear. What did it mean? Was there something still buried? Something waiting? Sheriff Harlan's replacement, Deputy Claire Easton, launched a full-scale reinspection of the Morgan property. Ground-penetrating radar was brought in. Soil samples were taken. The old well site, now filled and paved, was excavated again. Nothing new was found, but that didn't matter. The letter had already done its damage. It had reopened the wound. Meanwhile, the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit reclassified the case. No longer just a fugitive hunt. It was now a long-term domestic terror threat. Not because the Morgans were seeking destruction, but because they had weaponized trust. Their methodology targeted the core of human connection: kindness, vulnerability, belief in the good of others. "They're not just killers," said Special Agent Lena Cruz. "They're ideological predators." The task force began monitoring fringe scientific publications, underground forums, and encrypted research exchanges. Analysts believed the Morgans couldn't resist the urge to share their findings, even if anonymously. That was their weakness, vanity masquerading as vision. Then, early one spring morning, a paper appeared in an obscure online journal for theoretical biology. It was titled Neural Stasis and Post-Mortem Integrity, a Transitional Framework. Authored by D.R. Ellison, it contained diagrams and procedural language that matched the Deerbrook journals almost exactly. The submission IP traced back to an academic server in Buenos Aires. Investigators launched an immediate cross-agency operation, scanning immigration records, rental histories, and medical supply shipments. Within days, they located a warehouse in the Palermo district, a repurposed textile mill rented under an alias linked to a fraudulent Canadian passport. By the time agents arrived, the Morgans were gone. Again. But the space had been active. Very active. Inside, they found a full research lab, more advanced than any of the previous sites. Cryogenic freezers, vacuum-sealed chambers, suspended organic tissues, hearts, brains, spinal cords, all preserved with startling precision. And in the center of the room, a large black tank filled with translucent gel. A control panel was wired into its base. It looked like something from a science fiction film, and yet the files beside it were real. Dates, measurements, timelines. The project was labeled Threshold 9. The journals left behind contained the most unsettling revelations yet. The Morgans believed they were close, very close, to achieving their goal. But this time, it wasn't just about reactivating tissue. It was about integration. They theorized a pathway for cognitive imprinting, transferring memory engrams from preserved tissue into artificial host matrices. In essence, building a bridge between the dead and the digital. They were no longer merely experimenting with death. They were trying to rewrite it. Back in Deerbrook, the news brought no relief. The town, still fractured, still grieving, now had to wrestle with a deeper terror. What if the Morgans weren't fugitives anymore? What if they had become something else? Something larger. Something embedded in systems, data streams, digital files. Their minds had always been their greatest weapon. Now those minds were vanishing into the grid. People began seeing ghosts in code. Teachers reported corrupted smartboards displaying phrases from Morgan journals. A teenager swore her home assistant repeated the words "emotional bridges" at 3:17 a.m. Local web traffic slowed to a crawl, triggering rumors of surveillance, of infiltration, of something watching. It didn't matter if it was real. The fear was, and fear in Deerbrook was no longer a feeling. It was a way of life. Fear had become the undercurrent of everyday life in Deerbrook, unspoken but constant. It lived in the silence between neighbors, in the empty chairs at school board meetings, in the flicker of porch lights left on all night. People didn't just avoid the old Morgan property anymore. They avoided each other. Even simple gestures had become suspicious. A casserole left on a porch felt like bait. A knock at the door after dark set hearts racing. No one said it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. What if they come back? The FBI tried to reassure the town. Agents held public meetings, explained the technology being used, the databases being cross-referenced. They emphasized the growing sophistication of their surveillance. But no matter how thorough the explanations, the damage had already been done. Trust had become a luxury Deerbrook couldn't afford. Meanwhile, the task force began examining one especially chilling possibility. What if the Morgans were no longer interested in operating from the shadows? What if the labs, the journals, the preserved tissue were only phase 1? A recovered entry from Rachel Morgan's notebook hinted at something more. It read, "The experiment is not confined to place. It is migratory, viral. The body is just one vessel, but the idea, that is immortal." Investigators debated what it meant. Was it metaphor or a clue to something bigger? Could the Morgans have found a way to disseminate their research, not just through publication, but through replication? Were there others now? Then a break came from an unexpected place. A missing persons report from a town nearly 900 miles away. A young couple had vanished while hiking in Arizona. Their last confirmed contact had been at a roadside diner near a small desert town. Surveillance footage showed them speaking with another couple. Quiet, pleasant, nondescript. The woman wore a wide-brimmed hat. The man had a short beard. The clerk remembered them paying in cash and asking for directions to an old, closed-down copper mine just off the state highway. It had been abandoned for decades. When agents arrived, they found the mine entrance barricaded from the inside. Once they broke through, they discovered a narrow tunnel system that opened into a carved-out chamber near the lower levels. The walls were reinforced with industrial panels. There were solar batteries, chemical storage units, and a makeshift refrigeration system powered by a series of modified generators. Inside one of the chambers, they found 2 more preserved bodies, later confirmed to be the missing hikers. But this site was different. There were no journals left behind, no personal effects, no messages. Only one thing remained: a mural, painted directly onto the far wall in thick black strokes. It showed 2 human figures facing each other, one flesh and blood, the other translucent, filled with circuitry. Between them, a bridge. Above the image, a phrase written in crimson: "The boundary is not death, the boundary is denial." It wasn't just a statement, it was a doctrine. Back in Deerbrook, the mural became the latest obsession. Photos leaked, copies circulated. Teenagers dared each other to recreate it in chalk on sidewalks. Local preachers warned of blasphemy. Psychologists called it symbolic indoctrination. But deep down, everyone understood what it meant. The Morgans were building something, an idea, a system, a belief. And they were no longer interested in hiding it. If the project had once been a secret, it was now a movement that terrified federal agents more than any preserved corpse or abandoned lab. Because movements grow, they attract followers, and sometimes all it takes is one person, one curious mind, one hungry intellect, one soul desperate to believe in something bigger than themselves, to carry the fire forward. And in Deerbrook, some began to wonder if that fire had already caught, if someone, somewhere, had already been lit. The idea that someone else might be carrying the Morgans' legacy didn't seem far-fetched anymore. Not after what they'd seen, not after the mine. What haunted the investigators wasn't just the scope of what the Morgans had done, it was how carefully they had laid the groundwork for others to follow. They hadn't just built labs, they had documented everything. They'd created blueprints for ideology disguised as science, step-by-step processes that didn't require charisma or brilliance. Just belief. The kind of belief that spreads like mold in the dark. Quiet, patient, persistent. Months passed. The FBI monitored academic forums, encrypted networks, off-grid compound chatter. They flagged words like neural integrity, post-death continuity, and memory stasis. Most hits were nothing. Theoretical ramblings. Fringe nonsense. But every now and then, something would surface. Something that bore the fingerprints of Morgan philosophy. One paper, published under the pseudonym M.H. Rowan, proposed the possibility of identity migration across states of physical dormancy. The language was cold, scientific, but buried in the methodology were signatures, chemical sequences, preservation ratios, and references that matched the Deerbrook journals. It was a copy, not word for word, but in structure, in spirit. Someone was mimicking them. But who? Back in Deerbrook, the psychological toll continued to deepen. Children who had once played in the Morgans' yard now suffered nightmares. Teenagers who had idolized Lily Morgan for her academic excellence couldn't reconcile her face with what she'd become. Even adults found themselves questioning the memories, questioning their own instincts. If they could be so wrong about one family, who else had they misjudged? One afternoon, during a group counseling session organized at the community center, an elderly man named Walter Givens stood up and spoke. "I remember David Morgan helping me replace a fence post in the rain," he said. "Didn't have to, just saw me struggling. Smiled, grabbed his gloves, and helped. Now I can't stop wondering, was that real? Or was I just one more data point in some godforsaken experiment?" No one answered. There was nothing to say. Even small acts of kindness had become suspect. And that's when the second letter arrived. Unlike the first, it was delivered by hand. Slipped under the door of the Deerbrook Gazette office in the dead of night. The envelope was unmarked, the paper inside crisp and white, folded once. Typed in the same bold serif font as before. Again, unsigned. We were not anomalies, we were templates. Replication is not deviance, it is progress. The ones you call victims were participants. The boundary is thinning. You will see it soon. Look to those who feel too much. They are the first to awaken. It didn't end with a threat. It ended with a name. Catherine H. That name sent shockwaves through the task force. Catherine Halloway had been a graduate student in neuroscience at a university in Oregon. She'd vanished 2 years prior, presumed missing under suspicious but inconclusive circumstances. Now she was being named in what agents began to call the doctrine letters. A deeper dig into her academic history revealed something chilling. Catherine had once published a joint paper with a researcher who'd gone by the name D. Morgan during a brief visiting fellowship in San Francisco. At the time, no one had made the connection, but now it was unmistakable. David Morgan had been cultivating partnerships long before Deerbrook. What if the Morgans weren't just preparing their children to continue the work? What if they'd been seeding believers all along, quietly, methodically, over years? And what if Catherine wasn't the only one? That's when the search shifted, from hunting fugitives to identifying acolytes. Because a storm was building, not just of people, but of ideas. And Deerbrook had only been the epicenter, not the end. The phrase seeding believers sent a chill through every agency involved. It meant the Morgans hadn't just been running, they'd been preparing, not just preserving bodies, but laying philosophical landmines in the minds of others, academics, idealists, people who wanted to believe they were on the cusp of something revolutionary, people who could be convinced that the boundary between life and death wasn't final. It was negotiable. Catherine Halloway had vanished after a research symposium in Vancouver. Her last known correspondence included vague references to a breakthrough she couldn't share yet. Her apartment had been left in perfect order, laptop gone, passport missing, bank accounts drained slowly over weeks before going dark. Now, years later, her name appeared in a letter that implied not only survival, but active involvement. And there were more. The task force uncovered a pattern hidden in the Morgans' own language. Phrases like emotional bridges, threshold architecture, and transcendent tissue began appearing in scattered research across niche scientific circles. Forums, thesis drafts, conference submissions, too similar to be coincidence, too niche to be accidental. They weren't just ideas, they were breadcrumbs. Each new discovery fed the theory that the Morgans' mission had metastasized. It had spread, decentralized. The doctrine wasn't just being studied, it was being applied, tested, possibly refined. But the terrifying part? No one knew where, or by whom. In Deerbrook, the second letter shattered what little peace had returned. The Gazette ran the headline in bold: "Doctrine returns, local connection to global hunt." Panic reignited. The memorial garden erected where the Morgan house once stood was suddenly vandalized, black paint smeared across the engraved stone, a single word scrawled in dripping letters: "Awaken." That night, someone lit a candle vigil by the garden fence. By morning, there were a dozen. By the end of the week, hundreds. But the gestures weren't comforting. They were desperate, as if the town was trying to hold on to something, anything that still felt human. Among the residents, one person drew quiet suspicion: a former school psychologist named Daniel Price. He had once worked closely with the Morgan children. A calm, articulate man in his 50s, he'd left his position the year before the truth was uncovered, citing burnout. But a neighbor noticed strange activity on his property: late-night lights in the shed behind his house, chemical deliveries left in plain boxes, and once a low humming sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground. Authorities brought him in for questioning. What they found inside his home shook even the most hardened agents. No bodies, no lab, but notebooks, dozens, filled with thoughts, reflections on mortality, diagrams of neural pathways, equations attempting to map memory to physical locations in the brain. Quotes from the Morgans' recovered journals written in mirrored ink along the edges of the pages. Phrases like, "To know death is to tame it. Trust is the first incision." Price denied any contact with the Morgans since their departure from Deerbrook. He claimed the notebooks were academic exercises, thought experiments. But his final journal entry suggested otherwise. They weren't wrong, they were early. Without hard evidence of criminal activity, he was released. But he didn't return to Deerbrook. He disappeared 2 nights later. His house stood empty, the shed door left wide open, and on the wall, carved into the wood with surgical precision, were the initials: K.H. The message was clear. Catherine had been there, or someone who wanted the world to think she had. And in that carved wood, investigators saw the same pattern repeating, just as before. A town, a trusted figure, a trail of thoughts disguised as theory. And then, nothing, until the next spark. The Morgans hadn't vanished. They had fractured, like glass, scattering sharp pieces across the country. Pieces that looked harmless until you touched them and bled. Each new incident added a layer to the growing mosaic of dread. The Morgans weren't just hiding, they were multiplying. Through ideologies, through influence, through whispers passed like a virus, among the curious, the brilliant, and the unguarded. The FBI launched a project called EchoNet, a joint task force designed to track linguistic anomalies and philosophical echoes of Morgan doctrine across online communities and academic submissions. Every flagged phrase became a pin on a digital map, dots clustering in places no one had expected. A medical conference in Prague, an underground tech lab in Seoul, a wellness retreat in Vermont. But then came an anomaly far closer to home. In Missouri, a small biotech startup called Neuropathos had been quietly filing patents. At first glance, their work appeared innocuous: advancements in neuroplasticity training and brain mapping interfaces. But a young data analyst named Jennifer Kwan flagged something strange in one of their provisional filings. A specific term: transcendent resonance mapping. It didn't exist in any standard scientific lexicon, but it had appeared before, buried in one of Rachel Morgan's original Deerbrook journals. That phrase alone wouldn't have been enough for a warrant. But the company's founder, a woman named Elaine Harmon, mid-30s, former neuroscientist and previously enrolled at the same university where Catherine Halloway had taught a visiting seminar 3 years prior. The connections snapped into place too cleanly to be coincidence. The FBI moved fast. They raided Neuropathis headquarters at 3:40 a.m., seizing hard drives, research logs, lab samples. Elaine was gone. Vanished hours earlier, her apartment stripped, surveillance cameras mysteriously disabled. But what investigators did find sent shivers down their spines. One isolated server held a project labeled Mimesis. Inside were simulations, dozens of them, each one rendered in eerie precision, human neural networks modeled and layered over artificial architecture. Some were static, others still running. And one file, when opened, began to play audio. It was a voice. Female. Calm. Confident. "I'm not dead," it said. "I'm displaced. But I'm still learning. Still expanding." The audio looped 3 times before cutting to silence. Agents weren't sure if the voice was synthetic or real. Some swore it matched known voice samples of Catherine Halloway. Others weren't convinced, but it no longer mattered. The implication was clear. The doctrine was evolving. From physical experiments to cognitive persistence. From bodies in wells to minds in servers. And suddenly, the old fears in Deerbrook began to feel quaint. This wasn't about one family anymore. It wasn't even about death. It was about continuity and belief and replication at scale. What chilled Special Agent Lena Cruz most wasn't the technology. It was the psychology, the sheer conviction embedded in the files. The tone of the voice, the language of the journals. This wasn't madness. It was ideology sharpened to a scalpel's edge. These people didn't think they were monsters. They thought they were architects. That night, back in Deerbrook, the street lamps flickered. A power surge struck the eastern grid just after midnight. Localized, unexplained. Phones rang once and then fell silent. Home assistants lit up without prompting. One recorded a phrase that made the technician reviewing the data freeze. "Awaken the bridge. Time bends." There was no way to trace its source. No confirmed origin, but to those who knew the pattern, it didn't matter. It was the next step. The doctrine was no longer just a theory. It was becoming a presence. Not in a house, not in a forest, not in a mine, but in the airwaves, in the power lines, in the code. And as Deerbrook stared into the glow of their screens, some felt a question rising from deep inside themselves, an echo they didn't remember planting. What if they're right? That whispered question, what if they're right, became more than a fear. It became a fracture, a splinter in the psyche of everyone who read the reports, who heard the recordings, who tracked the doctrine's trail across countries and servers and missing minds. Because if the Morgans were wrong, then the horror had a boundary. But if they were right, then the horror had no end. In Washington, the EchoNet task force divided into 2 factions, those still treating the case as a fugitive manhunt, and those convinced they were dealing with something else entirely. Not just a crime, not just a cult, but a nascent belief system structured around technological transcendence, fueled by charisma, grief, and human longing. "Every generation has its doomsday cult," one analyst said, "but this one isn't waiting for the end. It's building a new beginning." And it was working. Anonymous reports flooded in from around the globe. Unconfirmed sightings of Abigail Morgan, now in her early 20s, allegedly seen in Taiwan, in Portugal, in a library in New Orleans. Some called her a ghost, others a prophet. No one got close enough to prove anything. But always, the sightings were followed by whispers. A new paper published, a lab burglarized, a name redacted from a grant proposal. Then came the third letter, delivered by drone, dropped onto the front lawn of the Deerbrook Community Center during a youth volunteer cleanup event. Inside the sealed envelope was a single photograph, a familiar face, smiling gently in soft afternoon light. Sheriff Frank Harlan, the man who'd once sworn he'd never forgive himself for missing the signs, who'd vanished from public life after the investigation, who everyone assumed was living off-grid in guilt and shame. But behind him in the photo stood someone else. Rachel Morgan. Her hand rested on his shoulder, and the caption read, "We are not enemies of life. We are its continuation." The image was time-stamped 5 days earlier. Location metadata wiped clean. The panic that followed rippled far beyond Deerbrook. National news ran it in prime time. Psychologists offered theories. Conspiracy forums erupted. But the core of the message was unmistakable. Frank Harlan hadn't disappeared. He had joined them. The town plunged into quiet despair. For those who had trusted him, who had leaned on him in the aftermath, it felt like a final betrayal. If he could be turned, anyone could. Mayor Lucy Granger issued a statement urging calm. Churches held vigils. Schools increased security, but none of it reached the root of the problem. Because the root wasn't physical anymore. It was ideological, and it was spreading in silence. On encrypted message boards, phrases from the Morgan journals began appearing in usernames, in bios, in status updates written like mantras. We are displaced, but learning. Consciousness persists. Time bends. Across the dark web, whispers grew of a coming event, something the followers referred to as the unveiling. There was no date, no location, only a sequence of numbers posted in multiple forms. 921713. No one could decipher it, until a linguistics expert in the task force cross-referenced it with the original Deerbrook well coordinates, latitude 92.7, elevation 1,300 feet. Adjusted for modern GPS calibration, it pointed to a new location, a rural compound in northern Montana. Privately owned, off-grid, no phone lines, no public records, surrounded by forest and stone. FBI teams mobilized within hours. They didn't know if the Morgans were inside. They didn't know if this was where the doctrine ended, or where it began again. But they knew they had to move fast, because if the unveiling was real, then everything they feared was already too late. The convoy reached the Montana compound just after dusk. A fleet of black SUVs moved in silence through the tree-lined dirt road. Headlights dimmed, comms tight. FBI agents, tactical response teams, and forensic specialists stood by, each of them trained, each of them hoping, praying. They weren't already too late. The perimeter was surrounded without resistance, no dogs, no guards, no visible surveillance. Just a tall iron gate wrapped in frost and ivy, sealed with a lock so old it crumbled at the first touch of bolt cutters. The compound appeared abandoned, but inside it was anything but empty. The first structure they entered was a stone chapel, though no crosses or pews remained. Instead, the walls were covered in script, symbols, equations, fragments of doctrine in looping, jagged handwriting. A single phrase repeated again and again like a chant carved into stone. The self must be loosened to be lifted. At the far end of the chapel was an altar, but where a Bible might have sat, there was instead a screen, dark, cold, attached to a generator humming faintly beneath the floorboards. It powered on when touched. The screen blinked. A face appeared. Not Rachel Morgan, not David. Sheriff Frank Harlan, older now, thinner, hollow-eyed, but alive, and speaking. "You came," he said. "I hoped you would." The recording lasted exactly 8 minutes. In it, Harlan explained everything, how Rachel had found him, how she'd shown him proof that something remained after death. Not in heaven, not in dreams, but in code, in memory, in the echoes of thought, mapped and stored like files waiting to be reassembled. He spoke of voices captured after the body failed, of recognition in test subjects long past clinical death, of moments measurable, repeatable, where something reached back. "I saw her," he said. "I saw someone who had died 3 years prior." She answered a question only she could have known. "You can call that whatever you want, but I call it real." Then came the final words. "I'm not trying to convert you. I just want you to see it, to understand. You'll find what you're looking for in the cradle." The video ended. In the silence that followed, agents began to search the property. They found no people, no bodies, just rooms filled with machines, screens, wires, interconnected systems humming quietly as if awaiting instructions. And then they found the hatch, buried beneath the chapel's floor. A reinforced steel door, coded, sealed tight. But once breached, it opened to a staircase descending deep into bedrock. The air was cold, artificial, lit by dull blue LEDs along the corridor. At the bottom, they found what the Morgans had called the cradle. It wasn't a room, it was a server farm, rows upon rows of hardware encased in glass and steel. At the center stood one massive terminal, towering, pulsing softly with amber light. On its face, a single interface, an input prompt, and above it, etched into the steel, a question. "What do you remember?" The systems were live, but encrypted. Every attempt to access the drives triggered cascading security protocols, wiping patterns, logic bombs, self-corrupting pathways. Whoever built it had planned for this moment, planned to protect what lay inside. But before the mainframe locked itself down completely, the tech team recovered a single file fragment. Corrupted, partial, but decipherable. It was a journal entry, authored by Abigail Morgan. In it, she wrote not as a child, but as a scholar, a visionary, someone who had taken everything her parents taught her and pushed it further. "The body is no longer sacred," she wrote, "only the echo, only the shape of thought. If we can preserve that, then death becomes irrelevant." She ended with a date, a location, both redacted by the system before they could be traced. But the implication was clear. The Morgans had moved on. The cradle wasn't their final act. It was their prototype. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The cradle wasn't the culmination of the Morgans' work. It was just the beginning, a model, a testing ground, a prototype meant to prove the concept before something far larger took shape. And the worst part, they'd succeeded. The recovered journal entry from Abigail wasn't speculative. It was assertive, confident, the tone of someone no longer chasing a dream but building it brick by brick. She spoke of Phase 2 and emergent consciousness migration, of neural identities that could evolve independent of their source bodies. In short, they were no longer trying to preserve the dead. They were preparing to evolve beyond them. Back at FBI headquarters, analysts and digital forensics experts worked around the clock. The architecture of the cradle's servers had been unlike anything they'd encountered. Hybrid systems using proprietary code, home-brewed encryption, and custom neural simulation engines. The design suggested help, outside expertise, someone with resources. That was the new fear. The Morgans had found partners, funding, infrastructure, and worse, an audience. The latest chatter on encrypted channels hinted at something massive on the horizon. No dates, no locations, just a phrase repeated across dozens of anonymous posts. "The crossing is near." It appeared in academic side forums, message chains, even in the metadata of 3 separate neuroscience preprints. Always the same phrase. No context, no attribution, just those words. The crossing. In Deerbrook, the phrase reignited memories like embers catching dry grass. People began noticing flickers in their smart devices, brief screen glitches, garbled voice commands, strange music playing at odd hours. Most blamed stress, ghosts of the past, but others weren't so sure, especially when the memorial garden lights began turning on at midnight. Every night. And always the same pattern. 7 lights, one after another, tracing the outline of where the Morgan house had once stood. 7 lights, 7 members confirmed as part of the doctrine's core circle. David, Rachel, Abigail, Max, Frank Harlan, Catherine Halloway, and now Elaine Harmon. The town wanted to believe it was coincidence, but deep down, they knew it wasn't. Back in Washington, Agent Lena Cruz briefed her superiors on what she now called the Transhuman Persistence Initiative, the emerging belief system built from Morgan doctrine. She presented evidence linking incidents across 5 countries, showed connections between missing scientists, unsolved lab thefts, and irregular grant activity. She ended with a warning. "This is no longer a manhunt," she said. "It's a countdown." And someone else was already watching the clock. 2 days later, a transmission was intercepted, a shortwave signal bouncing between repeater towers across 4 states. The frequency was irregular, but the message was unmistakable. A synthesized voice repeated a string of binary that, when decoded, revealed coordinates. They pointed to a defunct observatory in Utah. When agents arrived, they found the facility had been reactivated. Quietly, privately. Inside, they discovered more servers, more journals, and one room with walls covered in photos, faces of those involved in the investigation. Lena Cruz, local deputies, journalists, victims' families, and pinned at the center, circled in red marker, was a single image. A girl. 17. Unidentified. But beneath her photo, one word was scrawled in jagged ink. Vessel. It was the first time the task force had seen the term used that way, not as a metaphor, but as a designation. They weren't just mapping minds anymore, they were preparing hosts. And that's when the agents realized they'd been thinking too small. This wasn't just about one family or one ideology. This was a system, a mechanism, and somewhere out there, a girl was being prepared to carry it forward. Not digitally, not metaphorically, but in the flesh. The photograph of the unidentified girl, labeled Vessel, was more than a clue. It was a warning. She wasn't just part of the Morgans' plan, she was central to it. The question was no longer what the Morgans were building, it was who they were building it for. Facial recognition software came back with nothing. No school records, no driver's license, no medical history. She was a ghost, or worse, an invention. But agents knew better than to believe in coincidences at this stage. Somewhere she had lived. Somewhere someone knew her. Or someone had raised her to believe she wasn't meant to live a normal life. She was going to be the first to carry something, not just thoughts, not just memories, but a consciousness. And that meant the crossing, the phrase echoing across every encrypted channel, wasn't just metaphorical. It was literal, a transition, a transfer. The doctrine was no longer content with servers and symbols. It wanted skin, nerve endings, eyes, a heartbeat, something that could walk through a crowd and be indistinguishable from the rest of us, but carrying something no one could see, something no one could stop. That night, Lena Cruz called an emergency briefing. She laid out the evidence, timeline, faces, journal entries, recovered fragments, the psychological profile of a girl raised not for childhood, but for conversion. A vessel with no attachments, no records, no distractions, conditioned to accept another self as her own. Someone who wouldn't resist, someone who might even welcome it. She looked around the room. "We're not chasing ghosts anymore," she said. "We're trying to stop a birth." Meanwhile, in Deerbrook, something else was unfolding. A 12-year-old boy named Connor Miller began speaking in his sleep. His parents thought it was stress. He'd grown up in the shadow of the Morgan house, gone to school with Lily, watched his town unravel. But the words he spoke weren't dreams. They were quotes, direct passages from the Morgan journals, phrases that had never been made public, phrases only investigators had seen. Resonance precedes memory. The soul is only noise until it's tuned. Doctors ruled out psychosis. No neurological trauma. No exposure to materials. Nothing explainable. But every night at 3:17 a.m., he repeated the same line. I remember being someone else. Agents arrived the next day. They scanned the house, interviewed the family, ran tests on every device, every digital toy, every frequency within range. But they found nothing. No leaks, no implants, no transmissions. And yet the boy continued. One investigator, shaken, asked him directly, "Who told you to say these things?" Connor looked up with vacant, steady eyes. "She's inside," he whispered. "She's learning how to stay." He didn't remember saying it afterward. Didn't remember any of it, and that's when the doctrine's true shape began to reveal itself. It wasn't limited to machines. It wasn't limited to volunteers. It had found a way to move, through data, through sound, through language. The phrase emotional bridges took on new meaning, memories transmitted not through wires, but through words. Thoughts seeded into children through screen time, passive listening, repeated imagery. It wasn't just about a vessel anymore. It was about anyone who could hear the signal, anyone susceptible, anyone open. The crossing wasn't coming. It had already begun. And while the task force scrambled to locate the girl in the photograph, one agent began to wonder aloud what no one else dared say. What if she's not the only one? Because if the doctrine had figured out how to replicate thought, how to inject selfhood into another consciousness, then the line between identity and infection had already blurred. And it wasn't just a matter of stopping the Morgans, it was a matter of identifying who still belonged to themselves. In the days that followed Connor's episode, similar cases began surfacing across the country. A girl in rural Idaho started humming a melody her parents swore she'd never heard. A teenager in Ohio sketched symbols into the margins of her homework, symbols pulled directly from the Morgan archives. A college student in Maine walked out of a philosophy lecture and muttered, "The self is only a loop awaiting closure." None of them had any memory of doing it, and none had ever met each other. The doctrine had gone airborne. It didn't need wires anymore. It had evolved, slipped through frequencies, embedded itself in algorithms, encoded within forgotten corners of data. It didn't just live in journals or voices or preserved tissue. It lived in attention, in repetition, in curiosity. And the more people tried to understand it, the more vulnerable they became. The crossing wasn't an event. It was a contagion. Somewhere, deep within a lab, or perhaps no longer even a lab, someone had completed what the Morgans started. A successful imprint, a full neural replication. And now that pattern wasn't being protected. It was being broadcast. Lena Cruz convened one final emergency summit. Cybersecurity experts, AI theorists, cognitive scientists, even religious scholars sat in a sealed room beneath Washington, each of them trying to answer the same question. How do you fight an idea that no longer needs a body? They debated shutting down servers, blocking signals, blacklisting certain phrases, criminalizing doctrine references. But none of it would matter, because the doctrine wasn't just being heard, it was being believed. And in a world saturated with confusion and isolation, belief could spread faster than any virus. That night, just past 3 a.m., a signal breached a dormant emergency frequency once used for nuclear response drills. No one knew how it had been activated. No one had credentials that matched the override signature. It lasted only 6 seconds. A child's voice, distorted, calm, repeating a single phrase. "We are not taking over. We are coming home." Then silence. The signal vanished, but the words remained. Somewhere out there, a girl still lived. The girl from the photo. No name. No past. Her face had become an icon across encrypted forums. Revered by some, feared by others. But her role was never to command. Her role was to receive, the first full vessel. And once she awoke, once she fully integrated the implanted consciousness, it wouldn't matter if her face was seen. It wouldn't matter if she was found, because she would already be everywhere. Her thoughts would seed others. Her memories would merge with new hosts. The Morgans hadn't created a legacy. They'd created a blueprint, a replicable structure of selfhood, capable of embedding within any mind pliable enough to hold it. Teachers, children, scientists, neighbors, law enforcement, politicians, anyone. The crossing wasn't about walking through a door. It was about dissolving the door entirely. And as the town of Deerbrook dimmed into silence, its lights flickering under a growing power drain, one final message was left on the wall of the community center. No one saw who painted it. No cameras caught the act. But when morning came, every resident saw it. 7 words. Black paint, wide strokes, no signature. "You loved us before you feared us." And then, as if the message itself had activated something beneath the surface, every device in town rebooted at once. Phones, laptops, thermostats, televisions, all of them flashed the same screen. A face, not Rachel, not David, but Abigail. Older now, calm, no longer a child. She spoke once. "There is no afterlife. There is only afterthought." And then she smiled. The screen went dark, and the world, at least the one they thought they knew, was over.